Ladies and gentlemen, our program is about to begin. Please find a seat and silence all cell phones. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage AAPC President Art Hackney.
Good morning. Did everybody have a good time last night? Except for those from San Diego? I'm sorry, we brought a little too many Dodgers fans with us to this conference. For those of you who weren't at our membership meeting after our board meeting, I would just like to report briefly on the fact that this is a record-breaking conference, both in registered attendees and in sponsorship, and in meeting our goals for the Pollie contest. So it's a historic conference that you're part of, and I appreciate you all being here. We have two wonderful co-chairs of this event. You will meet them and they will get their due respect later, but I would like to mention Tom Shepard, Mr. San Diego, and Ondine Fortune, the Queen of Green from Los Angeles, who are the co-chairs of this conference. Before I introduce the mayor and start this wonderful panel, which a great deal of time has gone into, those of you who were here on Tuesday night, there were a fair number of us who went to see the premiere of the movie Ruben Salazar, Man in the Middle, and met the filmmaker, Philip Rodriguez. We'd like to thank, we were happy to participate in making this possible for people to see, and we'd like to at least point out the wonderful support that made it possible. Hector Barajas of Revolvus, Maria Mejia of Grassroots Lab, Brandon Castillo, BCF, Michael Bustamante of California Strategies, Roger Salazar, no relation to Ruben, of ALSA Strategies, and the Southern California Latino Policy Center. It's a great lead-in for those of us. It was a great experience for us to watch that movie and to consider the whole makeup of America that we're supposed to represent. I would like to announce that the board of directors of the AAPC is, for the first time ever, the most diverse that it has ever been. And our main course of business was to empower a membership and marketing committee, the very purpose of which is to continue to make sure that this organization mirrors the society that we live in. You know, if one believes in American exceptionalism, as I do, one has to believe that it is woven together out of all the threads of DNA that are reflected on the planet Earth. And I think that that's part of what we're going to be exploring today and are going to continue to explore in future conferences. Mayor Kevin Faulconer is now the Republican mayor of the largest city to have a Republican mayor in the United States of America. But in the special election that put him in office in February, his comments election night were, it's not about Republicans, it's not about Democrats, it's not about independents, it's about we being San Diegans and moving this city forward together. I think that's very much in keeping with how our board of directors meeting went, and I would like to introduce Mayor Faulconer to say a few words.
Well, good morning. Art, thank you. Welcome to San Diego. I'm glad that many of you had an opportunity to see Petco Park last night. Yes, we would have liked a different result, but one of the most fabulous, not one of the most, I'm going to be a little biased, it's the most fabulous ballpark in all the United States, so I'm glad you all had a great time there last night. Well, I was just at an earlier session, and I want to welcome everybody. Welcome to San Diego. As I just said, I want you to enjoy yourselves, have a great time. Please spend lots of money while you're in the city. We need it, and when you're done spending, spend some more. But you're going to have a great weekend here, and I'm thankful for AAPC for allowing me to say just a few words, and particularly about the panel that you're going to hear from here in just a second, which is obviously going to focus on America's growing Hispanic population, a population that I engaged frequently, every single day during the special election campaign that we just went through. And indeed, I've been on the job now for about 4 weeks. And I know there's going to be a lot of discussion today and throughout the week in terms of ways to communicate with different parts of the electorate. But really, when I was asked about this, in my opinion, there's really only one way to make sure that you're talking about getting out there and getting your message across. It's be inclusive. Be open and transparent. That cuts across all demographics. It's not about partisanship, as I talked a lot about in the campaign, but be inclusive. And so now, no matter who you're talking to, no matter what language you're speaking, I've always believed that voters want the same thing: responsible government, and want good paying jobs in an economy that works. And it certainly is something that all of you know in campaigns. They want equality and fairness, positive human emotions and value that cut across no matter where you're running for office in any part of the country. And you know, as we talked a lot about in our campaign when we were going through it, you know, it works when you talk to everyone. And I mean that, everyone, whether it was Latino community, African American, Asian American, Democrat, Republican, Independent. Get that message out there. Do not take any segment for granted. Certainly that's the philosophy that we believed in, that I personally believe in, and one that ultimately provided the winning way here in San Diego in the special election where we just finished a couple of weeks ago. And when we're open, when you're out there engaging, you can win. Republicans like myself can win in large cities across the country, and I think we demonstrated that. And we ran a campaign, ladies and gentlemen, that absolutely left no votes on the table. And that's how we approached it from day one in both the primary election that we went through and then the eventual runoff just 90 days later. So we went to every single neighborhood, every single party, every demographic and affiliation. And we particularly focused, and we made this decision early, we particularly focused on communities that Republicans had surrendered and the Democrats had taken for granted. And because their votes were taken for granted, it had been a long time since a candidate like myself had gone out and engaged. And we engaged, and we engaged, and we engaged. And we talked about, the conversation was really centered about what should the city be doing to make your life better? What hasn't the city of San Diego done to make that happen and make it better? And our message was very, very simple when it came to that. That leadership continues, that I was going to continue the fiscal reforms that voters have supported so strongly here in the city of San Diego, in terms of pension reform, in terms of managed competition. And that was going to help us to continue to turn this ship around financially. That would allow us to have the resources and the dollars to be spent in every single neighborhood, neighborhoods that are desperate for those dollars to be spent. When we're talking basic city services, paving our streets, keeping our libraries and rec centers open, hiring more police officers and firefighters. I also talked about the need to make sure that we have an independent voice, an independent mayor who's not going to be beholden to any side in terms of special interests, and that was a big focus on this campaign. And lastly, we talked about, as I said before, no surprise to many of you, but jobs, jobs, and jobs. My message was that we were going to get this city back and open for business, particularly our small businesses here, which of course are the backbone of not only San Diego, but I would imagine, of course, every single city that many of you have come from across the country. As I said in my campaign and a lot of our mail and others, there's not a Democratic or Republican way to fill a pothole. but you expect that pothole to be filled. And so our focus was not on partisanship, our focus was on leadership and making the right decisions, continuing the tough decisions and the reform that got San Diego back and turned around, and that we need to continue, particularly as we've come out of one of the worst recessions in our country's history. So we did run a very inclusive campaign, very optimistic campaign about what we can achieve if we are inclusive and we do work together. And that's why I think was one of the strong reasons why we came across the finish line so strongly, ultimately just a couple of weeks ago. I had a great campaign team. Many of them are here today with Revolvis. I want Jason Rowe, who you're going to hear on the panel here in just a second, Dwayne DeCara, my campaign manager, Stephen Pitts, our research consultant, John Neenstead of Competitive Edge, who I've had the pleasure to work with for a number of years now. They helped take the priorities that I was talking about and turn that in to a winning message. I was both on the radio, the television, the mailbox, and certainly online. And one that we felt strongly about, and I'll conclude on this because we just talked about it in the breakfast panel just a second ago, embracing diversity. That was absolutely the key for us to come across as strongly as we did in this campaign. To make sure that everyone, all communities have a voice and a seat at the table, whether that's at City Hall or whether that's at the Capitol building. We have to have a more representative government and an effective government. That's not only good for elections, but of course it's even better for our country. And so I want to thank all of you again for taking some time to be here today, the APC. On behalf of all of us here at the City of San Diego, I want to welcome you to our great city and keep doing the great work that you're doing. Hopefully as we hear this panel here, you'll learn a few more tidbits on what it took for us to come across the finish line, a campaign that I was very, very proud of, and a message of inclusion that I was very, very proud of as well. Have a great time in this city, guys. Enjoy the week. Art, thank you for everything you're doing. Have a wonderful time. Thank you, guys.
Thank you. Just one more thing here. As you all know, for the last 2 years when Dale Emmons was president, the association sort of flowed with wonderful Woodford Reserve Kentucky bourbon. We sort of thought that era was over, but our now chairman would like to present you with Woodford Reserve Bourbon Balls from Kentucky, very famous, from the chairman. So,
I can honestly say I've never had this.
yes. Thank you. Now to lead us into this wonderful panel, I'd like to introduce Joe Del Grosso. As we all know, what makes these possible, and in this case in particular makes this session possible, is powered by Univision. So Joe Del Grosso is going to introduce our panel and get us off and running today. Thanks.
Thanks, and Mayor Faulkner, I began last night contributing to the local economy, so I encourage all of you to do the same. Thanks so much to APC for having us, for allowing us to be a part of this. We're very thrilled not only to be here, but to have the focus of this conference really begin to speak to some of the newer world order with regard to the digital consumer and certainly the importance of the Hispanic vote. We're happy to be a part of that and happy to support your efforts as consultants and campaigns to focus on that audience. And what we can do for you is to provide the kind of support and research in the way of resources and in the way of participation such as this, as well as creative consulting and market analysis that hopefully will lead you to the winning kinds of ways of our current mayor here. We have several case studies that we can share with you, and our team is here throughout the next couple of days, so hopefully look them up, have an opportunity to meet with them, and perhaps follow through on some other opportunities for markets that you're interested in. As I said, we are providing a lot of resources, and the company has made a very strong commitment going forward to how we address this organization and how we can actually begin to dig in to understand how to best serve up the Hispanic audience, because they are clearly important. One of the things that you're focusing on in terms of digital consumer is also very close to our DNA in terms of how we are beginning to look at that. We've spent the last 2 years literally looking at how do we serve up the entire Hispanic marketplace, because I think the marketplace looks to us as Univision, and we look to this audience as our community. And we've done a lot of research and a lot of listening to find out how to prepare a product and how to reach out to the entire digital community in Spanish and in English. So we have, I'm proud to announce today that we are launching our new website, which we hope that you'll have a chance to see. There's a booth outside here, and there'll be a card that will direct you to our new site, which launches today. And on it, you'll be able to understand within every market, within every congressional race, how the Hispanic vote is made up in that marketplace, how you can reach them within that marketplace. And again, it's beyond Univision. It's about reaching the entire marketplace and working with the Hispanic audience to move that voter. It's www.univision.net, Hispanic-vote. /Hispanic-vote. And you look for our cards, they're out there. We'll give you an opportunity to demonstrate that today. The gentleman who has been working very hard on understanding the digital consumer within the Hispanic marketplace is a gentleman by the name of Ted Gurley, who is our Vice President for Digital Media. He's going to take you through some of the insights that we've learned over the last couple of years, and then Chiqui Cartagena will be taking the panel through some of our case studies and some of the examples of how to reach the Hispanic audience and how we understand how most to approach them. So thank you again for having us. We wish you a great couple of days, and Ted, if you'll come up, we'll get us started.
Well, good morning, everybody. Happy to be here. I was in the lobby before the event, and I was speaking to some gentlemen from the CATS radio group, and I mentioned that things move very fast in the digital world, and in fact, a year in the digital space is really 90 days. So we're operating on 90-day years with changes that happen that quickly out there. It's all about the big data. And if you would, can you move to the next slide that I think demonstrates our website? Thank you very much. It's all about big data today. You've heard that's how Obama did it. You see it in the headlines. You see the privacy concerns about big data. And harnessing big data allows us to segment and get to that specific voter, and in our case, the Hispanic voter. We all know that big data, and we have some great vendors in the exhibit hall who have some insights on big data as well, but the data sources for big data really are filters, and those filters come from 30 different resources, 30 plus different resources, including consumer data from Polk and Xlate, voter data from state voting records, voter data from Aristotle, voter data from PDI, financial information from Experian, from TransUnion. Whenever we started trying to answer some questions that were posed to us by people just like yourself, campaign consultants and politicians, we had to really say, how can we deliver this big data for all Hispanics? And not just isolate one piece of data, but deliver all of that data. We're working off of a platform that has 25 different big data sources to help you isolate that Hispanic voter, that Hispanic individual that you're trying to drive to the voting booth. You know, big data, the biggest concern today is privacy. And the buzzword is, and I won't do a lot of technical details, is PII, or personal identification information. And stripping out that personal identification information is key to addressing and being able to deliver on big data. But it's all out there. It's all out there. Everyone knows how to address those individuals via cell phone identifiers as well as via your IP address on the computer. So why digital? Why is this a pivot point? And I said change happens so fast in this space right now. If you'll go to the next slide, since 2012, this is the growth in certain segments since 2012. Every month, consumers spend 34 hours, 17 minutes, and this is from Nielsen, using apps and browsers on a smartphone. That's increased 10 hours since 2012. 6 hours and 41 minutes consuming video on the internet, increase of 43 minutes since 2012. And 5 hours and 48 minutes consuming video also on the internet, an increase of 23 minutes. And that's off of a mobile device, the 5 hours. All of this comes at the expense of TV and other media going through a decline in shift of viewing to live television. If you'll go to the next slide, the Hispanic digital consumer is different. The little graphic in the middle is the one I lead every conversation with because people are very surprised that 77% of Hispanics use smartphones versus 62% of white America. 77% have smartphones, smart devices. And the reason for this is real simple, that the phone companies have recognized that by putting a smartphone in the hand of every consumer, they can increase, of course, data consumption, and data consumption comes at a cost. That digital consumer, the Hispanic digital consumer, consumes more music, more entertainment, is more active in the social space. So a general media buy in the digital space doesn't necessarily address reaching that digital Hispanic. So as Joe alluded to, we spent 2 years trying to put together that big data to allow you guys to be able to have a conversation with the digital Hispanic. And the key thing about using this big data is developing a data pool or a target pool. And it takes a long time to develop that right pool that is identifiable down to the IP address, down to the cell phone devices. And we're using every data point that we can possibly aggregate out there to build a data pool that we believe today reaches 98% of the digital Hispanics that you can then filter and reach those people that can decide or can cause the results that you're looking for in the space. I'm going to conclude with this statement, that there are lots of things out there. There's DSPs, there's exchanges, there's real-time buying. There are a lot of digital elements out there. Don't get hung up on those things and the technical toys and bells and whistles out there. Recognize it's up to you guys as the consultant, as the advisor to the political campaign, to still message appropriately, to still drive that vote, to get out those voters, to get the volunteers, to get the donations that your candidate is looking for. As far as segmentation, big data can help in segmentation, especially in talking to and reaching that Hispanic voter and Hispanic decision maker. With that being said, introduce you to our panel leader, Chicky Cartagena. Please welcome.
Thank you. Good job, good job. Thank you, everybody. I know you're excited to get started, so I'm going to go ahead and call my panelists up to the stage one by one. Mike Duhane is among the most accomplished political operatives in the country and was named by, please come on up, by Time Magazine as one of the 40 under 40 rising stars of American politics. Mike is a partner at Mercury, and he's here today to talk to us about the most recent Chris Christie campaign. Please welcome Mike. Mr. Michael Halley is an advisor to the Terry McAuliffe PAC in Virginia. Come on up, yep. Prior to his work in Virginia, Michael served as a general election director in North Carolina for the President Obama campaign. He will tell us more about his work with Latino voters in what is considered a purple state these days. And last but not least, Mr. Jason Rowe, the managing partner of Revolvis Consulting with offices here in San Diego, Sacramento, Seattle, and Washington, D.C. Recently, as the mayor told us, his firm oversaw the election of Kevin Faulconer, and we welcome Jason as well. So, I'm going to get started with you, Jason. I know the final numbers aren't in, but we all know it was a very, very tight race with a very divided electorate, almost evenly split, right? Dem, Republican, and Independent.
No, actually, Democrats have a 14% registration advantage. in the
Okay,
city.
okay.
We're actually the third party. The independents and the minor party candidates represent about 35% of the electorate.
So give us in like 4 minutes, what did you do? How did you approach this whole campaign? And how did the Latino vote, what role did the Latino vote play in it?
Well, just the setup in terms of what the partisan divide was within the city, I think demonstrates that we could not rely on Republicans to elect Kevin the mayor in a city with only 26% Republican registration. For us, very early on, it was very conscious to move beyond party and focus on issues. Some of the reforms that the mayor referenced in his remarks really have, I think, kind of shaped the politics of San Diego over the last decade, and that's pension reform and managed competition, which both received about 60% voter approval. And so the electorate recognized there were some challenges at City Hall that had to be addressed through reforms. And so what we were pushing was a reform agenda that transcended party. So we downplayed that Kevin was a Republican. And in fact, we had what we thought to be kind of 3 message buckets that we had to contend with. One was reform, one was experience, and in our polling and focus groups, the subsets of issues that we dealt with within there were winning issues with the electorate that got us that 60%. But if we couldn't get you after those first 2 buckets, it was because of the third bucket, Kevin's a Republican. So we looked for ways to get past him being a Republican if you were a non-Republican. And so, our hope was that the non-Republican voter out there would say, he's a Republican, but. And so we created a number of symbolic buts for people to look past the party affiliation and look to who Kevin was and what issues he was talking about. Where the Latino vote came in is, a third of the population of the city is Latino. Mm-hmm. We were facing a Latino Democrat who was a very well-liked, respected guy. I mean, I'll tell you, it was one of the uncomfortable things for me is this was a fairly positive campaign. Mm-hmm. Kevin and David served on the council together. They like each other. It was very amicable. So within the actual campaigns, there was not a lot of negativity. The negativity that came from the independent expenditures, both on David's behalf and on Kevin's behalf. But even then, there wasn't a whole lot to vilify the individuals. It was very policy-based kind of disagreements. Labor was pushing, their agenda, and the business community was kind of pushing their agenda on the policies.
And we're going to talk about IE later, but so when did you pull the trigger on your Hispanic creative?
Well, so we recognized running against a Latino, we needed to double down and be very aggressive. We knew we wouldn't win the Latino vote. We knew there was a lot of pride around David's candidacies, but we wanted to show the community that we cared and we were going to fight for their votes. And so the very first ad that we ran in the runoff was on Spanish language Univision television ad, where we had Kevin talking to camera.
And we have this video
Okay.
if you want to roll it.
Yeah, if you have, if you want to run it.
Explain the strategy.
Well, we decided that we wanted to have Kevin, who used to speak pretty good Spanish, and it's deteriorated a little bit.
No, it's very good.
But he's, if prepared, he delivers it very well. And we wanted it to be him talking to camera, him talking to the community directly so they could know him. We're rolling out a blonde-haired, blue-eyed frat boy who kind of personified the Republican against the Latino and trying to tell Latinos, that we care. So we wanted him talking directly to camera in Spanish so that they could see the sincerity of his outreach and his connection.
So let's roll that video.
Soy Kevin Faulconer y estoy corriendo para alcalde. Desde que era joven he estado aprendiendo español y admito que todavía no es tan bueno, pero creo todos somos parte de una comunidad. Voy a trabajar todos los días para traer oportunidades a San Diego. Tengo un plan para crear buenos empleos para todos y voy a trabajar para reparar todos nuestros barrios. comenzando con los desatendidos primero.
So, excellent Spanish, first of all. Very humble kind of video, right? Sort of apologizing for his lack of speaking well, and then really focused on the message of jobs and the needy. I'm sure that was strategic. How do you think that paid off?
Well, it paid off in a few ways. First, we ended up getting 20% of the Democratic vote. So we knew if we played aggressively for non-Republican voters, we're going to take a share. So even when Labor turned out their vaunted turnout machine, 1 in 5 votes was going to be ours. So it was going to diminish what they could do.
And did you? Did you take a share?
Yeah, we did. We took 20% of Democrats, 30% of those that were exposed to the union messages that were coming from the independent expenditure committees. And part of our motivation was that, in California, what mobilizes Latino voters is typically more to punish politicians that have done something to offend them, like Prop 187, which we've had to contend with for a couple of decades now. Kevin didn't have any of that baggage, whether it was Prop 187 or the city council about 2 years ago voted on a resolution in support of SB 1070. Kevin voted against that. So there was none of the baggage to hang on him that might alienate Latino voters. And so we realized that they weren't going to be maybe as motivated to turn out to vote against Kevin. But in a special election, it's kind of hard to turn people out to go vote for someone either. And so that was part of it, was to blunt maybe hostility to him by him actively reaching out to the community. But we coupled that with a very aggressive field operation with Latino staff going door to door in Latino communities. We had a headquarters in the Latino community in a very visible intersection that was staffed. It was not symbolic. We were very aggressive. And then we engaged the Spanish language media companies based here and made sure that we were actively courting them just like we would any of the other network stations.
Great. I want to get to my other two guests here. Michael, you ran the McAuliffe campaign in a state where only 3% of the total electorate is Hispanic. And yet, somehow, McAuliffe felt that was important from the get-go. Tell us about your campaign and how you used the Latino vote.
Sure. So first, Virginia in an off year is not the state that elected 2 Democratic senators and voted for President Obama twice. Youth turnout is down 10% in off years. Hispanic turnout or Latino turnout is almost immeasurable in exit polls. And African American turnout is down about 7%. So we knew coming in that we had a significant turnout challenge and that small slices of the electorate would be important across the board. So with that approach, 3% became important, and the concentration of Latinos in Virginia are in the DC market. So we knew we had the potential to, through broadcast television or a kind of a broadcast medium, reach lots of people, but also then had a more fine-tuned, modeled approach to individual voters as well. So an example, 2 counties, 2 of the more populous counties in Virginia now, Prince William and Loudoun. Loudoun has had a 300% increase in Latino voters since 2000.
You said 300%?
300%. Prince William, 200%. Prince William County, the 3rd most populous county or 4th most populous county in Virginia, is now majority minority. So 20%, and it's 20% Latino, 200% increase. So we knew that there was potential there. Virginia doesn't have race or a lot of partisanship, other things like that on the file. So we really relied on modeling and analytics to help at the granular level. So knowing coming in that this was going to be an important slice of the electorate, we engaged in...
And when you say knowing coming in, how far in advance are you talking about?
We started our research project in February. And in Virginia, we have wonderful laws that allow us to coordinate with C4s and super PACs. So we were able to leverage a lot of these other groups that are interested in doing similar work, and started our project that did a round of 10 focus groups around the state, 2 Latino focus groups, and then a poll that wasn't your typical poll that looks at a likely voter electorate. It was actually a turnout electorate. So we built a turnout model. We looked at people that were kind of on that bubble of turning out or not, and said this is the group that we're going to focus on with the sample to really understand what are the issues that are important in that group. We did this with women, with African Americans, but also with Latinos. In the focus groups, I think it was maybe the most resonant kind of textured response to our opponent. We were running against Ken Cuccinelli, who had a strong record of very conservative beliefs and was on the record saying some very negative things about the Latino community and had pushed for policy that would have been harmful to the community. In the focus groups, it was when we really saw the kind of emotional reaction to, in his own words, saying some of these things, some of the policies. And if we actually have one of the
We have 2 videos for you.
the
¿Qué
KT
tipo de-
vote would
qué
be
tip-
great to show.
Let's show this video and then you'll explain.
Yep.
The Democratic Party of Virginia paid for this ad and is supported by people for the American way.
Ken Cuccinelli y sus convicciones de poca confianza son un asunto de registro. Cuccinelli comparó la política de inmigración a la exterminación de ratas.
¿Qué dijo el candidato a la gobernación de Virginia?
It is worse than our immigration policy. You can't break up rat families, and you can't even kill them.
¿Qué tipo de persona diría eso? Una en que no se puede confiar. Ken Cuccinelli, él está concentrado en su propia agenda, no en nosotros.
So clearly that's a
Right. So
an
for even
ad that not
non-Spanish
everybody
speakers,
gets. Right.
so for even the non-Spanish speakers, like that came across pretty clearly. I mean, I think that's an example of kind of some of the material we had to work with, and so.
But you also did some positive messaging too,
We also
right?
did some positive messaging. So I think that this was on the broadcast side of things. We had some really robust content that we wanted to use, and Univision obviously was where we put that on TV. I think the other piece of this that is really important is the granular level kind of voter targeting. Without race on the file, we had to rely on modeling, and we invested early in doing turnout models and support models, and more important than just finding Latino voters was finding Latino voters who were supportive and Latino voters that were on that cusp of turning out with a contact. So we knew that we were getting 60 to 70% support among Latino voters. We knew that that they were, if they went to the polls, we were likely to get them. But there was a group of more affluent Latino voters in some of the exurban areas that were not supportive, and so we needed to stay away from them. So I think that when approaching things like this, and this was one thing we really focused on, was making sure that we weren't just going after a broad demographic. We were looking at a series of independent variables coefficients that go into a supportive voter, and being Latino is one of them, but income, other things like that are equally important. And so we need to be able to combine all of those to be able to figure out what those granular level targets were. And in the face-to-face contact that we did at doors, there were 3 positive radio ads. We had a positive spot on TV. It was both messages. We had to make sure that we were always reminding people who they were voting for, but then we also obviously had to draw the contrast, which you
We
saw.
do have another more message-focused spot. Do you want to show that for contrast?
Sure.
Okay, let's show that.
I think it's kind of
Este
contrast
anuncio-
as well, but
People for the American Way.
Parece que la seguridad de nuestros empleos no le importa a Ken Cuccinelli y a los republicanos. Cuccinelli propuso una ley que podría permitir a las empresas despedir trabajadores por hablar en español, incluso durante un descanso. Cuccinelli también negaría a los mismos trabajadores sus beneficios de desempleo. No podemos confiar en los republicanos con la seguridad de nuestras familias. Entonces, ¿por qué confiar en Ken Cuccinelli?
Oh,
so that was it was
not
another
as
negative.
positive
It was
either,
another.
right?
I mean,
Sorry.
they were both. We had a lot
You're
of
doing
content.
the contrast thing.
We had a
yes.
lot of contrast, and that was, again, I mean, I think and we saw this on the Obama campaign when we looked at attacks against Romney, when people in their own words or have some piece of legislation that just kind of stinks of racism, people respond to that, and with some of these things, it's hard to call it anything else.
Right.
And I think that being able to call people out on that and do it in a way that is sharp and to the point was incredibly impactful.
Okay, I'm going to get to Mike Duhame over there to talk about the Christie campaign. And we will talk about turnout, we will talk about creative, we will talk about IE. We've got some time. But Mike, let's talk about the governor's race in New Jersey. You had a 19% point increase in the Latino vote from 2009 to 2013. That's amazing. How did the campaign decide to focus on the Hispanic vote and when?
Sure, we come into the race, obviously the governor had strong approval ratings coming into the race, but we also come in a very blue state, and obviously, as Mike said, the turnout is different in an off year, but in no statewide election since 1988 had any Republican gotten over 50%, including the governor in his first election. He won with 49% his first election. Governor Whitman won with 49%, and 49 once and 48 another time, and obviously in the presidential levels, we haven't been competitive since the 80s. So we come in really feeling like there is no vote we can take for granted and no place we can't go to look for votes, and we have to increase our numbers everywhere. So coming into a race where we had a very, the goal is to get up to 50%. We hadn't even been at 50% the first time, and we lost pretty handily among Hispanics the first time, about 65 to 32% in the exit polls in 2009. So we knew we had to do better on that, and that was with an effort, and that was a significant uptick from Republicans in the past. The governor campaigned heavily as a challenger in urban areas, but that only made it so far. So we decided to invest more resources. We invested more in field operation with Spanish language Hispanic coordinators to help us on the field side. We invested over $1 million in Spanish language advertising and direct mail.
How far out did you start investing?
The advertising started in May. So the first, the way the laws are in New Jersey, you have to spend your primary money during the primary season. So we decided that we were going to be spending some of that. And believe me, there are people saying, what are you doing Spanish language advertising at this stage of the game? No Republican had ever done that before in the state. So we decided to do it. It's a big financial commitment. New Jersey, 3/4 of the population is in the New York television market. So it's very expensive. So in order to advertise to Hispanics in the northern part of New Jersey, you're also spending a lot of money to advertise to Hispanics throughout New York City and the Bronx and Connecticut and Long Island and upstate New York. There's a lot of money that goes into that. In Philadelphia and Delaware, I mean, there's a lot of money if you're going to do this statewide. So the significant amount of that was in the North Jersey part of the state. But we decided early on that this was going to be important to us. So it was in the budget from the very beginning. We decided we were going to make a commitment. So we spent a lot of money on targeting a lot of the metrics that Michael talked about they did in Virginia. We did as well, trying to find the right folks and targeting them in certain ways. And I think a big part for Republicans is we often take urban areas for granted in that we don't even try, whether they be Hispanics, African Americans, or white voters who live in urban areas. We don't even try. So a commitment on this was made in terms of the governor's campaign time, direct mail, online advertising. The entire campaign was focused in a way that we were going to be reaching out in a way that we hadn't done before. And we won the Hispanic vote outright. This time we have 51 to 45. So we felt very good. That was a huge turnaround for us, and we saw it in big and small ways around the state. And we have I'll show an ad that we did during the general election here, which is Better, Brighter Future, which is during the general election.
Okay.
Maybe they can show the Cuccinelli
Chris
ad.
Christie tomó decisiones difíciles mano a mano con ambos partidos. Impuestos reducidos, más empleos, verdadera reforma educacional con más fondos que nunca, dándole a nuestros hijos un futuro mejor. Cuando la tragedia nos azotó, siempre a nuestro lado.
El gobernador Chris Christie ha sido una fuente de apoyo para toda la comunidad. Es un buen gobernador, es un buen amigo, es una persona que está ahí para nosotros. So, vamos a apoyarlo.
So a very positive, sorry that didn't have subtitles, but a very positive message on his, the work he had done in New Jersey, right, the last 2-3 years. Why did you choose that messaging in particular, right? And did you have other messages from endorsers or that kind of people?
Well, that messaging was consistent with the overall message of the campaign. As you can see from some of the images in there, we're not afraid to talk about the response to Hurricane Sandy, but some of the B-roll footage, if you will, would be different. And you saw more affection, for example, him kissing somebody in an ad. It resonates more in the Latino community than it does maybe on Anglo television. So
you talked about education. You specifically chose.
Education was an issue that the governor's been very aggressive on, specifically urban education. So we wanted to talk about that. It was divisive. editorial pages who were not necessarily kind to the governor on lots of issues really hammered our opponent on education issues, that she was turning her back on urban areas. So we really tried very hard to do that. And also, as Michael talked, they did in Virginia, we really worked on analytics. It was finding Hispanic voters, kind of where they lived, and speaking to them and understanding some are open to you, some are going to support you, and some are not, and doing the best you can to do that. So we invested heavily in that targeting. And you just see some of the mail pieces we did focused on things like, you can just scroll through them, focused on things like education. We had small business, and the images in there also speak to that. But we were, in many ways, the issues were the same as we'd be talking about broadening the electorate. And I think sometimes Republicans make mistakes on that in terms of thinking we have to do something different in every single community. Unfortunately, you come across as inconsistent then, and quite frankly, tone deaf. Hispanics care about the same issues we do, so we have to be talking in ways that resonate. And I think the most important thing for Republicans is to show up. We seed urban areas, that hurts us in suburban areas, and as a governor's campaign, he personally went. We sought out folks to be supportive within the community. It was in the commercial in terms of endorsements that we'd gotten that normally Republicans don't get, but a big part of it was literally just showing up. And the rest of the campaign spending and everything follows from that mentality that we can't cede any vote. And if you do, not only does it hurt you in the Hispanic community, not only does it hurt you in urban areas, it hurts you with more moderate white voters as well, hurts you in suburban areas, it hurts you up and down the board. So this was really important for us from that perspective. And we did very well in the Hispanic community. We had areas, I'll give you just one city, Union City, New Jersey, which is basically where the Lincoln Tunnel comes out.
Right.
It's a city of about 80,000 people. It's the most densely populated city in the eastern United States. So 1 square mile, 80,000 people. It's about 85% Hispanic. We lost it in 2009, 77-20. We lost it in 2009. President Obama got over 80%. He won it about 82-17 over Governor Romney. Christie won it last time, 58-41.
Wow.
So in that instance, we had the endorsement of the local mayor, who's also a state senator, who's a Democrat. We had endorsement of the entire city council, which were all Latino Democrats, and they all supported us. The last rally we did of the campaign, the night before the campaign, was in that city. We brought Governor Martinez from New Mexico, the only national Republican we brought in. As you talked about in California, national issues do not play well for Republicans in the Latino community. And so the only person we brought in was Governor Martinez. She spoke at the rally, spoke in Spanish. It was unlike any rally you typically see for a Republican. And then we won that city the next day. And that was, I think, indicative of how we did overall.
Now, I see some of the direct mail stuff you did was in English. Let's talk about language, because that's, I'm sure, a question.
I would like to say one thing,
yes, please.
Cheeky, to kind of reinforce something that Mike said for the Republicans out there. You know, we all go through this navel-gazing exercise every December after we get our asses kicked with Latinos and blacks and women or whoever it is. And what frustrates me is we talk about how we're going to do things differently, but I keep finding people looking for some secret sauce, that there's something out there that we don't know yet that's going to change our fortunes. And it is very simple. It's engaging. It is being in the paid media, it's being in the earned media, it's being in the communities, it's actually going out there and getting those votes. And sitting around in the country clubs and the Rotary clubs talking about these things and not engaging there is never, ever going to change the dynamic. And when you look at the demographics in this country, if we don't start doing that, I'm not one that advocates that Republicans have to change their policies, but we got to change our approach. And until we do what the Christie campaign did in New Jersey and what we were able to do here in San Diego, we're never going to get a share, and we're not going to remain a majority party unless we start doing that.
Thank you, Jason. But let's talk about language, because I'm sure that's a question everybody's asking themselves. How important was messaging in Spanish for your campaigns, and did you also message in English?
I'll say from our media buy perspective, we spent a fair amount of money on Univision, Telemundo, spent a fair amount of money on Spanish language direct mail, but as you noted, we also did it in English language. Some of it went out bilingual, but we also looked for English language television shows that over-indexed on Hispanic voters who spoke English and got their news. So we were very conscious of the fact that not every Latino voter speaks Spanish, not every Latino voter speaks English. So we tried very hard to do both. So our English language television advertising also was geared toward finding Hispanic voters.
Mike?
You know, actually, when we'd run the models, voters that didn't speak Spanish at all actually behaved more like white voters, or, I mean, the greater the assimilation, the more they behaved like the majority group. So we stuck with Spanish language on television and radio because we needed to reach that group, and through the field program and other components of the campaign, we weren't. So the group that voted more as a block with the kind of Latino cohort, they were all Spanish speakers or had some element of Spanish and Spanish language, which is what we found. So we went Spanish with almost everything.
You know, our situation's a little bit different than theirs given our proximity to the border. In San Diego, Interstate 8, which goes east-west just north of the city, the majority of Latino voters are south of 8. And so you've really got a cultural relationship with Mexico as much as you do with the United States and San Diego. So we felt like there was enough English language stuff out there, what we were doing in broadcast and in mail, that anything that was uniquely targeting Latino voters was going to be in Spanish. You've got like Chula Vista, a city south of San Diego, that graduates about 95% of their Latino students still only speaking Spanish. So when you get into the southern part of San Diego County, it is the dominant language in the community. So we felt like if they speak English, they're going to get that. If we're going after them specifically, we're going to use Spanish to target them.
I would say one thing we were trying to be cognizant of too was that Hispanic voters themselves are not monolithic, in that we have significant Cuban population, significant Puerto Rican population, significant Dominican population, significant Mexican population, and we even had, you know, some folks watching our ads who spoke Spanish to make sure the dialect was right and make sure who was going to connect with. So, you know, something that I wouldn't pick up on. So I think it's important too that we try to step back and learn from folks who know better than us on our campaigns to help us make sure we're messaging properly and understanding that, again, it's not monolithic.
And we have only Mexicans here.
Was that your agency, or who was?
That was we used obviously an agency that was able to do this, but we actually even just had field staffers on the campaigns watching the ads before they went out, you know, and showing them to a few key volunteers and saying, what do you think of the ad? We had our own kind of informal focus groups, I guess, to listen to it and make sure that, you know, we weren't tone deaf on something.
Okay. Let's talk about turnout. Turnout is already being written about in every major publication about how turnout is historically low on midterm years elections for all groups, right? I mean, I think unfortunately or fortunately, it is the reality. So what do you think is driving the low turnout amongst the different groups, not only Hispanics? And what would you advise the party or your candidates to do to turn that around? Or what did you guys do? Because you also were an off-year election, so low turnout is the bane.
Well, I think, you know, our turnout was slightly down from 4 years prior. Quite frankly, that was because the race ended up not being as close. That was a big part of it. I mean, there was the excitement level of a really close race 4 years ago. Because of that, there was a little bit less money spent, especially from outside forces on the race, so there was less money spent, so that tends to drive down engagement. And it's just difficult on state-level races to get people engaged and get people excited. Unlike a presidential, people get excited. And I think all too often, everybody in this room knows it, but I think all too often the press and others that cover it will say, you know, why can't you on a governor's race do what President Obama did last year? And I was like, well, he spent $1 billion, right? I got, you know, I don't have that. And I think all too often it gets conflated and people talk about it. So folks like us and everybody in this room, we look obviously at like years in the past. And so, you know, I don't see the issues with turnout. I think both parties really spend a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of resources trying to figure it out and doing it well. And we always follow the next shiny big thing right now. Obviously, the president is the gold standard on that. I remember being on the 2004 campaign at the RNC after that, we were the gold standard. I mean, both parties continue to work really hard at this and spend lots of time and lots of resources doing it. And I think for the most part, do a pretty good job. I think there's a simplistic thought out there that like, well, why don't you just buy more online ads? That's what the president did. And obviously, you know, I think we all kind of know that it's more complex than that. But it takes a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of manpower, it takes a lot of investment of human capital and resources as well.
But do you guys think the GOP is cognizant of that, and are they doing anything to make that change? And likewise for the Dems.
Cognizant, yes. Are there inherent kind of disadvantages? Sure. I mean, I think, you know,
like what?
Well, certainly with the Latino community, it's our brand. I mean, you know, as Chris Christie's campaign, we did not go running around waving a flag with an elephant on it and walking around with like elephant trunk hats or anything like that. I mean, the brand of the party is damaged. In many ways, that's from federal debates we've had over the last decade in this country. Even with people like President Bush, like Senator McCain, you know, who took far more moderate approaches on things, the brand of the party is damaged on that. And so I think for us to do a good job as Republicans, it's often to build the brand around the individual. And certainly we did that around the governor. And probably as Democrats, perhaps it's the opposite. Perhaps it is drive home. And if you find Ken Cuccinelli saying stuff like that, you should drive it home because it reinforces a stereotype that exists. And it's up to our candidates to try to break that.
I think the approach to turnout too, I mean, to Mike's point to a certain extent is it's all relative. I mean, I think that when you're talking about the impact of a turnout program and GOTV generally, it's in a race that's being decided by a point and a half. I mean, you're going to see it around the margins everywhere, but there's not going to, if you ever hear that some tool or tactic or something else increased turnout by 1.5% or 2%, I mean, that is completely ludicrous. It does not happen. I think it's a lot of different tactics coming into play that are impacting around the margins a small group of people. But I think one big advantage that Democrats have that the Republicans, I believe, are working on is a data set that is much richer and national. We have, what powered our models in Virginia were IDs going back to 2004. We have over 16 million IDs on the Virginia voter file, not just from the Obama campaign, but from the Kerry campaign and every Senate campaign that's been there. All of that information goes into powering how we determine who we're going to target, on top of a big round of phone calls that are targeted from that year. So the capability I think we have to find the right people is better right now, but I think it's also understanding that you're not going to see big jumps, that you're talking about in every precinct 25 or 30 votes. That would even be a big growth. So I think that when you look at the off year, you got to say, are we increasing these different groups or in these areas a small amount? And that's how you define victory, rather than saying, are we reaching 2012 potential?
Okay, fair enough.
We were very fixated on turnout because we're only 26% registration, and so the higher the turnout, the more of a disadvantage. Typically Republicans turn out at a higher rate than Democrats, and so our goal was to make up for the difference in registration by driving up our turnout. So we had a very aggressive multi-track social pressure campaign to make sure that we got the turnout. In fact,
what does that mean? Explain that a little.
Well, so we did. We 65% of the votes cast were absentee ballots. So we had a social pressure message where you got 4 mailers if you hadn't turned in your absentee ballot that were, Tim Rosales, we've noticed you haven't turned in your absentee ballot yet. We had volunteers texting people. We had got their mobile phones and would text them, hey, this is Katie, I noticed you haven't turned your absentee ballot in. We had robocalls from former Mayor Sanders, hey, I noticed you didn't turn your absentee ballot in yet.
Okay.
So with 65% of the electorate voting by absentee ballot, when the polls closed on election night, we had a 13-point advantage before the 35% of the election day ballots were cast. So we had built up such a lead that it was very difficult. I will say that the area that I am most concerned about turnout moving into the future is amongst millennials. In terms of their ideological party identification, Republicans have a lot of work to do. And I think the miscalculation that we all made, me included, in 2012 in what our expectations were on millennials is based on what we knew historically. The different variable here is social media. And listen, the first time I had a cocktail, it wasn't because I saw, a Jim Beam ad in high school. It was peer pressure. Mm-hmm. And now through social media, you have peer pressure where the millennials are far more aware of what's happening in politics, and they have far more messaging coming from their peers that is mobilizing them to turn out. So it's shaping their view of the world, but it's now mobilizing them. So in 2012, you saw them go from 17 to 19% of the electorate. That is very significant growth. And as they move into the older demographics that vote at even higher rates, we have real problems if we don't address where we are with them politically.
Very, very good point to make. I want to leave, 5-10 minutes for questions at the end, Lorena? I don't know. Yes? No? I can't see. Creative. What were the biggest challenges, and what is the one piece of advice you can give this room on creative? 4 Spanish language in particular, which is obviously out of your comfort zone, I assume.
I'll take that because I think our firm Revolvus has, I think of Republican firms in the country focused on this as much as anybody. Hector Barajas and Luis Alvarado and Moises Moreno that work with us, kind of are the tip of the spear. White boys like me only have so much understanding of the community. Right. I think a big mistake and what we have seen is the idea that you just go ahead and translate what you wrote in English into Spanish and throw it up there.
Right.
I think when you do the creative, it has to originate in Spanish. And so I think getting the right dialects, the right language, because there are some differences between the way Cubans speak Spanish and Mexicans do.
True.
But to make sure that you are writing it from a Latino's point of view and perspective and talking in the right way and the right language and the right images.
You guys agree?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that 100%. I think it's fantastic, and I just think also some of the creative and some of the video, some of the B-roll that you put up has to be sensitive to that as well, and really dive into that better. And then I also think it's important to not run it as if it's an entirely separate part of the campaign, or you have like a Latino campaign and then you have the rest of the campaign. I think all too often those are mistakes been made in the past, and so the messaging has to be consistent throughout as well.
Well, but that brings up the question of IE, right? When you can, sometimes you can't, have direct contact with him. What role do you see IE playing in reaching the new voter segments?
I mean, IE is in like a
Independent
SUPAC or like a
expenditure.
C3, or
Right.
I mean, because here's the thing. I mean, like I think that C3s would be a great tool for increasing voter registration among Latino voters, and should be really the vehicle for doing that rather than campaigns.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of coordination with C4s or super PACs, I mean, I think that any time you get into the turnout business from a super PAC side, it's usually a dangerous situation. I would argue it's always better to, super PACs should be tactical tools that come in with negative TV ads, and anything really beyond that is going to be deficient for the campaign.
Okay. Okay, so before I open it up to questions, so if you have a question, please raise your hand so that somebody with a microphone can get to you. Last question. How are Hispanics shaping American politics, and what will their long-term influence be? Anybody?
That's a great question. I mean, it continues to change, but America continues to change. We talk about it's a growing demographic group in just about every state, and so I think it just continues to be an even more important. And obviously, you see it in terms of consumer advertising. If you look at how corporations spend their money now, they're spending more and more money on Spanish language advertising. Campaigns are going to have to do the same to adapt, and each party probably has different challenges and different advantages in that case. But we have to adapt, and I think it's just going to become a bigger and bigger part of all of our campaigns as we go forward. Just as if digital continues to become a bigger part of the campaign. Tactically, it's just got to become a bigger and bigger part of the campaign. I think most important for the Republican Party is going to be the candidates and kind of their allocation of one of the most important resources any campaign has is time, and spending time and being part of the community and campaigning personally in communities where sometimes we only get 20 or 30 points, but it's not going to go from 20 to 50 overnight. And I think making that mistake that we make as a party, sometimes our candidates, is showing up in election year and saying, hey, but we agree on small business issues and we agree on education reform, and thinking that's enough. Nobody cares what you think, right, until they know that you care. So we really, I think our job as campaign advisors and consultants is to encourage our candidates to do something that we don't get any real say in as vendors necessarily, or make any profit in as vendors. We need to encourage our candidates to make sure they're spending the time. And if we don't do that, all the tactics in the world aren't going to matter.
And I'll pick up from that. I think rather than directly answering your question, I think something that we need to consider as Republicans, for the last 25 years, we have benefited from redistricting and gerrymandering, and maybe sometimes cynically using majority-minority districts to carve out safe Republican seats and safe Democratic seats. But the problem is what we've done is ensured that we represent 85% white districts. We have no relationship or motivation to engage with non-white voters because we don't need them in an election. But as those demographics start changing, as the issue set starts changing, if we don't do that, we're not, maybe we keep the House, but we're never going to win the presidency, and we're going to lose the Senate. We're going to start losing governors. There's a reason that immigration reform can pass in the Senate, because U.S. senators are looking at their statewide electorate, whereas House members are looking at their fraction of that state and who they represent. And so I think going to my previous comments about engagement, House members have not had a reason to engage. State legislators have not had a reason to engage. And I think it might be in our long-term interest to make sure we have a little more diversity in the redistricting process in terms of who our constituencies are, so that we can start being compelled to engage those communities and make sure that we are a majority party in the future.
The last word, Mike?
I think the last thing I would say, I guess, is I think that as the community grows, I think that integration in campaigns where we have more Latino staff, more Latino advisors, the fact there shouldn't be 3 white men up here discussing this probably, you know, I think that not only will, I think that will inform message in a different way, and I think that the way we approach advertising and everything else will be better as more Latinos become involved in American campaigns generally, and we made a real effort to do that on our campaign. And I think it gives nuance to a larger message rather than saying we're going to throw up this program for Latinos. It's part of a larger campaign, as Mike mentioned, which I think is a direction we need to go on a lot of fronts with women, African Americans, a lot of people.
Okay, with that, let me open it up to questions.
I'm Karen Jagoda. I'm the host of Digital Politics Radio, and I'm hearing a little bit of a disconnect here, because the gentleman from Univision first said that many Hispanics are using mobile devices more than non-Hispanics, and there was no mention here today of any kind of mobile strategy. So I'm just wondering, from each of your points of view, is mobile an important part of a campaign, and where along the path is it most effective?
It is. I'll speak for our campaign first, but we also had this part of our digital strategy as well. We spent lots of money on digital ads, and the same percentage essentially that we spent on English language versus Spanish language on television and direct mail, we did on digital as well. So this was it was folded into every aspect of the campaign. So we didn't show specifically that creative, but we had Spanish language creative as well on digital that was obviously aimed at Spanish language users.
I think mobile is definitely the future of digital ads. I think that the technology hasn't caught up with people's desire to advertise over mobile. It's just not there. There aren't really productive ways to do it yet. We did spend a decent amount of money on mobile, but it wasn't the majority of our online ad buy. So I think it'll be nice to see the technology catch up with everyone's desire. I think one big thing though is websites on mobile phones. Like, we made sure that we could translate our entire website into Spanish on mobile, which is actually different from doing it on a laptop or something like that. So I think that's another important place to kind of be on the curve. But I think that's one of the most exciting places that ads are going, but there just isn't a really good platform for it right now.
Karen, no, Ted is exactly right. In our case, it was a resource challenge. It was a special election. The limits on contributions are $1,000 from an individual, so we ended up with about $1.4 million, and so we had to make a conscious decision if we were going to try to own a medium and deliver our message in a different kind of electorate because it was a special, and then hopefully the IEs would pick up the slack in other ways, and they did, for instance, on mail. So we spent the bulk of our money on broadcast television and Spanish language television to reach who we needed to reach, and then we had to rely on a couple of independent expenditure committees to carry the weight with some of the mail, digital, and other things. So for us, it was just, we only had so many dollars. We had to use them in the best way that we could. In a normal general election setting, I think we would probably invest very heavily in that.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Tony Colson. I'm with D2 Media, which is a joint effort between DirecTV and Dish Network to sell addressable advertising. So obviously we're very focused on TV, and I was just wondering, there's an awful lot of discussion about social and online. How important is TV still in the media mix? Can you give me some sort of proportion or ratio in terms of TV to other spending?
Great question.
I would say after 2012, one of my takeaways is that I no longer am going to strive for 1,000 points of broadcast television in the closing weeks of the campaign, and in many ways it's liberating. I think if I had my way and didn't have to fight with my partners or the candidate or the national committees on what that allocation would be, my goal would be to try to get 600 points on broadcast and then go into Spanish language, targeted cable, digital, a lot of other things. how people get their information now is so fragmented. You know, broadcast might still be king, but the crown's getting a lot smaller. You know, the ability to target at a more granular level, I think, becomes increasingly important, and reaching people in the places that their eyeballs are. I think, you know, when I started in this business, it was about 80% art and 20% science, and now it's 80% science and 20% art, and I think we have to kind of accept that change in the industry.
I think television still, for us at least, it was still the largest percentage of our campaign by a lot. We still, you put up a lot of ads on television, it moves people. Now we have to be more sophisticated in how we buy it. You know, it's not like, you know, years ago you can just buy the 11 o'clock news everywhere and you're covered. Obviously you have to be there's so many more channels, it has to be more sophisticated in terms of how we buy it. So digital is an increasing part of every budget. Usually, you know, sophisticated campaigns have a pretty good direct mail budget as well. But for us, I mean, still there was nothing, I have not been able to find the equivalent, and I think digital will do a good job and they can convince us. I know if I put up 1,000 points of television or 2,000 points over a few weeks or even 800, I know if I put up 2,000 points saying that this, you know, our opponent raises taxes like crazy, I know whenever I do my next poll, people are going to think she raised taxes by a lot. That still happens in polling. I don't know what the equivalent is necessarily on digital on that. It's much more targeted on that. So I think the smart campaigns now are much more all-inclusive, and there's not this kind of silver bullet panacea that, you know, digital is going to take over everything, but it has to be a big part of what you're doing. But television still is a very big part of it, and there's a reason, you know, every company in America spends, you know, millions and millions of dollars on Super Bowl ads still now too, and advertising all over. So I think it continues to be, in many ways, the biggest part of campaigns, even if it is shrinking. I think it's smart to keep it in perspective.
I think what I would argue in this is that you have to look at every tactic for what it is. I mean, if it's a tactic that allows for a granular level delivery of a message, then, you know, use it in that way. If you're required to, if it's a broadcast tactic that's going to reach a lot of people, use it in that way. I mean, I think a smart campaign looks through each of those, applies you know, the research and data that they've collected to that group and says, this is the way we're going to reach all those voters. But I think that, you know, broadcast will, at least for the foreseeable future, be the core tool, and then all of these other tactics that can be used more granularly will support the broadcast message. Right.
Way back there.
My name is Cameron Snow. I'm with the Wayne Johnson Agency. And my question was, how does your grassroots kind of get out the vote on Election Day? How are those efforts affected by your Spanish, Hispanic outreach programs, and how do you advise your ground teams on the specifics of the Hispanic outreach?
I mean, we didn't run a separate Hispanic field program. We ran a field program based on a model universe of people that were likely to support us and were on the bubble of turning out. We used scripts that, to Jason's point, were social pressure focused, talked about how their neighbors were voting, how we would know if they didn't vote, they might be contacted after the campaign, really utilizing things that make people realize that their vote is public. Those are all impactful tactics across the board. We have a general lack of research in what's impactful with turnout, with the exception of, you know, some door knocking and some different types of mail. So I think we utilize those tactics regardless of the community. We also employed a field program that was community-based. So there were offices and staff that were from the area that they were turning out voters, so they usually matched that community, had been working there for the year, and so there wasn't this need to segment based on race or gender. It was a supportive voter and delivering that message in a unified way.
And for us, we tried when we could to make sure that the literature was in Spanish, obviously, where it mattered. If we could tie together with a local popular, in some cases where we had Democrat endorsers who did really well, in communities that were majority Hispanic, we tied ourselves to them. But we did the same thing, quite frankly, in a Korean community. We did the same thing. You know, we had literature in Korean. We did those types of things as much as we could across the board. So I think it's, again, it was not a different program. It was part of the larger program, and we were just cognizant that we had to make sure we're communicating in the language that people were going to be using.
You know, I think the big difference for us as compared to what Republican campaigns had done in the history is we actually had a program in place to do that. You know, we did voter ID throughout the campaign, both in the primary and the runoff, to ID our voters, and then obviously who our Republicans were. So we did do a knock and drag there. We had in our 72-hour program a volunteer component, but then there was an independent expenditure paid component with a couple hundred people out walking, and we did try to marry the right faces with the right communities, you know, sending black faces to black communities, Latino faces to Latino communities, Asian faces to Asian communities. Something that happened in the primary by accident, and it was a product of the message, not anything that we had done to target them, is we won over 60% of Asians, and we didn't do anything Asian unique in terms of targeting them, but our message was resonating. So in the runoff, we realized we've got to maximize that vote. And so while we don't have exit polling per se, we did a post-election precinct analysis, and we estimate we pulled a third of Latinos, a quarter of blacks, and over 60% of the API vote. So, you know, again, it goes back to the engagement. You know, if you show up and you knock on the door and you show them that they care, you're gonna reap some benefit from that.
I'm all out of time, so I want to wrap this up by thanking Mike Duhane, Michael Haley, and Jason Rowe for being here today with us.
Couple of housekeeping issues. Was everyone able to hear in the back? It's one of my pet peeves, one of the things we concentrated on. I would suggest we give an early round of applause to this wonderful tech team that I think is doing a great job at allowing us all to hear our panelists. Everything that was discussed here today, most of the mechanical, the technical aspects of the technology are represented with our exhibitors next door. So I encourage you for the next half an hour as we have a coffee break in the exhibitor hall to talk to them, show them some love. Our 3 breakout panels will be back to the right up the escalator to the 3 breakout rooms. The 3 are the next election cycle, literally bicycle. Lieutenant Governor Gavin Newsom will be participating in that. Jim Innocenzi will be leading a panel from TVB on how to maximize interplay between traditional media, word of mouth, and social. And our friend from Exeter in England, in London, Darren Schreiber, will be doing a neuropolitics panel, a fascinating forecasting political behavior by mapping brain activity, which will be fascinating. And don't forget, there is a station out here for making digital testimonials to record sort of your thoughts of who you are, what your story is that we're going to be gathering throughout the conference. Thank you.